Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the programs manager here at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. As many of you may know, YIVO is a really special place for the research and education about Jewish history and Jewish culture. At the center of YIVO is our archive and library, which consists of over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books cataloging the history and culture of the Jewish people. And our work here is to make those materials accessible. We have classes about those materials. We have public programs. We have exhibitions. We have research fellowships. And people come from all around the world to do research here with our materials. So what we're here for tonight is something very special. A few years ago, YIVO had a conference called Jews and the Left, which Jack Jacobs was the chair of. And this publication, which we're very excited about, in many ways grew out of that conference. So it's very fitting for us to be hosting the launch of this very important book. So before we hear from Jack, I'm just going to introduce Marion Kaplan, who is the chair for this evening, the moderator. Marion is a Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at NYU, and she's a 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner. So please join me in welcoming Marion.
Thank you. Now I have to lower the mic, and Jack will have to raise it again. So Jack Jacobs is Professor of Political Science at the Graduate Center and John Jay College of the City University of New York. He's the author of many books that deal with tonight's topic. These include On Socialists and the Jewish Question After Marx, which was New York University Press, Bundist Counterculture in Interwar Poland, which was Syracuse University Press, The Frankfurt School, Jewish Lives and Anti-Semitism, which was Cambridge University Press. He's also edited Jewish Politics in Eastern Europe, The Bund at 100, which was NYU Press, and is the organizer, as you just heard, of the conference that led to his editing of the book we're celebrating this evening, Jews and Leftist Politics, Judaism, Israel, Anti-Semitism, and Gender. Professor Jacobs has been a visiting scholar at Tel Aviv University, Leipzig University, Vilnius University, and was also the Workman's Circle Dr. Emanuel Pat Visiting Professor at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. He's been the recipient of many renowned grants from American and international foundations, and most recently, he was the Lewis and Helen Padnos Visiting Professor at the University of Michigan in the fall of 2016. He is currently the Jacob Kronhill Visiting Professor at YIVO. It gives me great pleasure to introduce such an accomplished scholar and my friend, Jack Jacobs.
It is, in fact, microphone adjusting time. My thanks to Alex and to the YIVO for organizing and for sponsoring this event. Thank you, Marion, for that lovely introduction. And my thanks to the 17 superb scholars who contributed chapters to the book we're celebrating this evening. I genuinely appreciate your support and encouragement. Jews played highly visible roles over an extended period of time in the leadership of leftist movements, including socialist, communist, and anarchist organizations around the world. In the first half of the 20th century, significant numbers of Jews were also evident in the rank and file of specific left-wing political parties. In addition to participating in general leftist movements, Jews in Eastern Europe created and fostered a number of distinctive Jewish socialist parties with tens of thousands of members. Why were so many Jews sympathetic to left-wing causes? Explanations revolving around the purported characteristics of Jews, around the impact of Jewish religious ideas, and around the marginality of the Jewish population have been expounded by prominent scholars. However, there's reason to question both of the first two of these explanations. At the present point in time, left-wing ideas no longer hold the same degree of attraction for Jews as they did, let's say, 75 years ago. The relationship of Jews to the left was historically contingent. It was specific to political, historic, economic conditions that prevailed between the late 19th and the mid-20th centuries in Europe, and that impacted upon Jewish political opinion in the United States and other countries which received large numbers of Jewish immigrants from Europe. In a book which first appeared in 1911, the sociologist Robert Michels noted the abundance of Jews among the leaders of the socialist and revolutionary parties of the day, and he attempted to illuminate this phenomenon by reference to what he called specific racial qualities, which, according to Michels, make the Jew a born leader of the masses, a born organizer and propagandist. Michels asserted that among these qualities were, and I'm quoting him now, sectarian fanaticism, which, like an infection, can be communicated to the masses with astonishing frequency, an invincible self-confidence, halavai, remarkable ambition, an irresistible need to figure in the limelight, and last but not least, an almost unlimited power of adaptation. That sounds to me like a famous Woody Allen film, but we'll leave it alone. He cites examples of the predominance of persons of what he referred to as the Hebrew race in leftist parties in Germany, Austria, the United States, Poland, and adds that Jewish involvement with socialist parties is also linked to the Jewish response to continuing anti-Semitism. Some scholars interested in the relationship between Jews and the left have emphasized not supposed Jewish qualities, racial or otherwise, as did Michels, but rather purported similarities between Judaism or Jewish religious ideas on the one hand and ideas supported by leftist writers on the other. Dennis Fishman, for one, argued that Marx approaches the standpoint of the Jewish tradition in his stress on the indispensability of human action. According to Fishman, Marx echoes the Jewish motifs of partnership in creation and dialogue. Michel Loewy, far more compellingly, has made creative use of Max Weber's notion of Wahlverwandtschaften and has written of an elective affinity illuminating links between Jewish messianism and a revolutionary libertarian worldview, suggesting that the views of such thinkers as Ernst Bloch, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, Gustav Landauer, Leo Leuwenthal, and George Lukács can all be clarified to varying degrees through reference to the affinity he describes. A third explanation for the attraction of some Jews to leftist ideas revolves around Jewish marginality. Isaac Deutscher, himself a leftist of Jewish origin, claimed that Marx, Luxemburg, Trotsky, among others, dwelt on the borderlines of various civilizations, religions, and national cultures, were born and brought up on the borderlines of various epochs, and this, he proposed, enabled them to rise in thought above their societies, their nations, their times, their generations, in his terms, to strike out mentally into wide new horizons. Now, the notion that Jews are a race, the key to the first of the proposed explanations for the relationship of Jews to the left, has long since been discredited by reputable social scientists. The idea that Judaism per se is intrinsically progressive, the second such explanation, in my opinion, is not tenable. There were and are Jewish leftists who have found elements of the Jewish religion to be compatible with their political proclivities. Jewish religious beliefs, however, can and have led many to deeply conservative political positions. But Deutscher's explanation for the one-time link between Jews and the left, the fact that it's colored by his political sympathies notwithstanding, has a great deal of merit. Jews were regularly marginal in the societies in which they lived when the left came into being and in the era during which it developed. Jewish marginality and the political, economic, and sociological conditions which existed in the 19th and 20th centuries and which fostered marginality clarify the political implications, the political inclinations of Jewish leftists of earlier generations. The rejection of Jews by mainstream society contributed to their sense that a dramatic political change was both desirable and necessary. The left arose out of the French Revolution, and it was initially committed to that revolution's ideals: liberty, equality, fraternity. Indeed, the term leftist originally referred to those French political leaders who supported the revolution. Specific French leftists in the National Assembly, none of whom were Jews, endorsed the emancipation of French Jewry. The positions taken by these founders of the French left led some Jews in France to ally with the left. There are known, for example, to have been Jewish Jacobins in Saint-Esprit near Bayonne. Left-wing movements, of course, ultimately came into being not only in France, but in many other lands. And in general, these movements tended to favor equal treatment of citizens and opposed, in general, the legal disabilities which had been imposed upon Jews in specific countries in earlier times. To be sure, individual, highly visible leaders of the left were not immune from anti-Jewish prejudices. The Russian anarchist Bakunin, who was of aristocratic non-Jewish origin and who was a foremost leader of the First International, penned an essay in 1869 in which he proclaimed that modern Jews are par excellence exploiters of others' labor and have a natural horror and fear of the popular masses whom, moreover, they despise, either openly or secretly. The habit of exploitation among Jewry, Bakunin continued, gives it an exclusive and baneful direction entirely opposed to the interests as well as to the instincts of the proletariat. However, despite the views of figures like Bakunin, the left was generally open to the participation of individual Jews within its ranks in ways that the European right was often not, and many late 19th century leftists, though not all, ultimately opposed the anti-Semitic political movements that came into being in that era. It was by no means the case that outspoken opposition to political anti-Semitism and personal attitudes rooted in prejudice or in stereotypes were mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, it's significant that German social democracy, the world's strongest Marxist-influenced movement in the latter decades of the 19th century, was less anti-Semitic than other major political parties in Imperial Germany. Indeed, many Marxist-oriented parties operating at the end of the 19th century or in the first decades of the 20th had positions on the so-called Jewish question similar to that of German social democracy. The leading figures of the Marxist movement in France were opponents of political anti-Semitism, as were the leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Edmund Zilberner, among the first scholars to conduct sustained research on the attitudes of leftists towards Jews, once asserted some 60 or so years ago that there is what he called an old anti-Semitic tradition within modern socialism. However, the attitudes of leftists towards Jews were actually far more differentiated than Zilberner's conclusions might lead one to believe. there are important, deplorable examples of anti-Semitic leftists. But Zilberner, to the contrary, notwithstanding, there's not an undisputed tradition of anti-Semitism on the left per se. The relative openness of the left made it possible not only for individuals of Jewish origin to become involved in leftist movements, but also in some cases to become leaders of such movements. Karl Marx and Ferdinand Lassalle, who were of Jewish descent, are manifestly among the most important mid-19th century leftists, and they exemplify the highly visible roles played by individuals of Jewish origin in left-wing movements at a specific historic moment in time. Marx knew little about Jews or Judaism. Karl was converted to Lutheranism at the age of 6. The school he attended as an adolescent from 1830 to 35 had been founded by Jesuits and was attended primarily by Catholics. As a university student, however, Marx became friends with the young Hegelian and Protestant theologian Bruno Bauer and took a course taught by Bauer. It's not surprising, therefore, that Marx paid very close attention to Bauer's work on the Jewish question and that he published responses to and critiques of Bauer's perspective. Bauer had insisted that Jews who did not have full civil rights in Prussia would not be emancipated until such time as they had renounced Judaism. Marx replied to Bauer, most famously in On the Jewish Question, and he stressed that there was a distinction between political emancipation and human emancipation, and noted that Jews were entitled to the former even if they did not first abandon the Jewish religion. For Marx, perhaps surprisingly to some of you, the extent to which Jews had been granted equal political rights was a criterion by which to judge the modernity of a given state. Marx never devoted sustained attention to the Jewish question after he wrote the discussions of Bauer's work noted above, though he referred to Jews in passing from time to time. And in so doing, he regularly made use of slurs and epithets, particularly in private letters to Engels and others. These statements and the review of Marx's writings once led that same Edmund Zilberner to proclaim in an article published in 1949 that if the pronouncements of Marx are not chosen at random but are examined as a whole, and if by anti-Semitism aversion to the Jews is meant, Marx not only can but must be regarded as an outspoken anti-Semite. But as was the case with Zilberner's more general pronouncements about the socialist movement as a whole, this assessment has been contested. Henry Pachter, for one, asserted that the term anti-Semitic, as we understand it today, does not apply to the author of On the Jewish Question and to his contemporary audience, which understood his meaning in the context of the Hegelian philosophy and its language. It should be noted, however, that even if one rejects the label anti-Semitic as inappropriate when applied to Marx, and there's good reason to do so, it remains the case that Marx expressed personal antipathy towards individual Jews. Lassalle, the founder and the first president of the General German Workers' Association, was, at the height of his career, one of the world's most prominent socialists. He was born and raised in a Jewish family. Indeed, Lassalle's mother was strictly Orthodox in her observance of Jewish religious ritual during Lassalle's youthful years. Lassalle never formally converted, but he became estranged from Judaism, particularly as he became acquainted with Hegelian and young Hegelian thought. However little Marx published on Jewish matters, Lassalle published even less. Indeed, there are no works by Lassalle meant for public consumption which focus directly on Jews, on Judaism, or on Jewry. Lassalle's private correspondence, however, is particularly revealing. In one letter he notes, "I do not like Jews at all. I even detest them in general. I see in them nothing but the degenerate sons of a great but long past epoch. As a result of centuries of servitude, these people have taken on the characteristics of slaves, and for this reason, I am hostile to them. At another point, he proclaimed, listen up, there are, above all, two classes of people that I cannot stand, writers and Jews, and I, unfortunately, belong to both. So, like Marx, Lassalle's attitude towards Jews was characterized by lack of interest in Jewish affairs and by personal antipathy, a matter quite distinct from advocacy of political anti-Semitism. Now, how might we explain this personal antipathy? The late Robert Wistrich used to rely on a psychological diagnosis, self-hatred, in explaining both Marx's attitude towards Jews and that of Lassalle. As used by Wistrich, Jewish self-hatred referred to negative attitudes on the part of a person of Jewish origin towards Jews that were linked to feelings of rejection, which arise in an individual who cannot achieve full acceptance by virtue of his or her origin. Though not out of the question in Lassalle's case, the diagnosis of Jewish self-hatred seems to me far-fetched in the case of Marx, who was not inclined to think of himself as Jewish at all. Wistrich insinuated that Jewish self-hatred was evident not only in Marx and Lassalle, but also in lots of other figures of Jewish origin active on the left, and wrote in general terms about the role which Jewish self-hatred played in activating what he called latent prejudices in the socialist movement. But Wistrich did not actually provide compelling evidence in support of his contention and painted with an overly wide brush. To be sure, internalization of anti-Semitic hatred has affected any number of individuals of Jewish origin. And on the other hand, as Wistrich was well aware, there's no reason at all to presume that self-hatred is or was more common among Jewish leftists than among Jewish conservatives or others. Exceptionally prominent leftists of Jewish origin in the generations immediately following those of Lassalle and Marx include Edward Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg, Victor Adler, Otto Bauer, Max Adler, Emma Goldman, Alexander Bergman, Pavel Axelrod, Julius Martov, Trotsky, Leon Blum. Some may well have exhibited traces of self-hatred, others didn't. They had rather different attitudes towards Jews and issues of interest to the Jewish community. The list of world-renowned figures I've just recited should not be taken as suggesting that most leftist leaders have been Jewish. August Bebel, Eugene Debs, Friedrich Engels, Charles Fourier, Antonio Gramsci, Jean Jaurès, Karl Kautsky, Peter Kropotkin, Wilhelm Liebknecht, Robert Owen, Plekhanov, Proudhon, Renner, Saint-Simon, none of them were Jewish, nor were many, many other key figures of European or American or other socialist or communist or anarchist movements. And nevertheless, the presence of Jews and individuals of Jewish descent in the leadership of leftist movements was at one point in time considerable and was regularly disproportionate to the percentage of Jews in the general populations of the countries in which these Jews were active. Particularly in the first decades of the 20th century, there weren't only a remarkable number of Jews in the leadership positions of certain leftist parties, but also disproportionately high numbers of Jews in somewhat lower positions in these parties. An analysis of the family backgrounds of those who participated in the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party Congress of 1907 reveals that 23% of the Menshevik delegates were Jewish, and 11% of the Bolsheviks at this Congress were Jews. 18 of the 29 People's Commissars in the government of the Hungarian Soviet Republic of 1919 were Jewish. Official communist sources, not inclined to exaggerate on this subject, estimated that 35% of the membership of the Communist Party of Poland, the KPP, was Jewish in 1930. Jews were manifestly present in leftist movements in a number of different countries during the 20th century. But this fact does not by any means imply that most Jews in these countries were members of leftist parties. It's not so. The total number of members of the Communist Party of Poland in 1930 was about 6,600. To say that 35% of the members of the party in that year were Jews is to suggest that 2,310 members of the KPP were Jewish. Well, a census conducted by the Polish government found in December of 1931 that there were 3,113,933 individuals of the Mosaic faith in Poland at that point in time, which means, you do the advanced math, way less than 1% of the Polish Jewish population, way, way less, was formally associated in the KPP in the early 30s. Jews created and became involved during the 19th and 20th centuries not only in non-Jewish leftist movements, but also in explicitly Jewish leftist organizations. Urbanization, modernization, pauperization, proletarianization, the decline of rabbinic authority all contributed to the sparking of left-wing sentiment among East European Jews. Unlike in Central and Western Europe, where many Jewish leftists were both acculturated and linguistically assimilated and were inclined to work within general non-Jewish political movements, East European Jewish leftists and certain Jewish radicals who left Eastern Europe to settle in other parts of the world regularly felt that the needs of the local Jewish populations, including the fact that many East European Jews were native-born Yiddish speakers and not fluent in the languages of the non-Jews amongst whom they lived, that made it necessary to create explicitly Jewish socialist parties or organizations. Moreover, the socioeconomic structures of the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were sharply different than were those of Jewish communities in Central or in Western Europe. The proportion of East European Jews who were middle class or wealthy was considerably lower than was, for example, the proportion of German Jewry that could be so characterized. This made East European Jewry a more fertile recruitment ground for leftists than its counterparts in the German-speaking lands. There were actually 4 different competing Jewish socialist parties in the Russian Empire in the era of the Russian Revolution of 1905. But the Jewish socialist parties which had been active in the Russian Empire did not long survive the Bolshevik consolidation of power. The Bolsheviks were unwilling to tolerate such movements and over time pressured them to dissolve. To be sure, the Jewish Workers' Bund and other Jewish socialist parties reconstituted themselves in interwar Poland. Most Jews active in or sympathetic to the Bund, the left Zionist parties, or the non-Jewish leftist parties of Europe suffered the same fate as did the rest of the Jewish population during the Second World War. Almost all European Jewish leftists who remained in Nazi-occupied Europe during the war died or were murdered during the course of that conflict. The base of support for the Jewish left in Europe was all but completely eliminated. There were attempts made to reorganize the Bund and certain other parties in Poland when the Second World War was over, but the Bund was no more able to exist in communist-dominated Poland than it had been in the communist-controlled USSR. The explicitly Jewish left arose among East European Jews at a specific point in the 19th century in the context of urbanization and shifts in the class structure of the Jewish population and a decrease in the strength of traditional Jewish religious authorities. Some of these parties, like the Bund, achieved successes. Along with all other Jewish left parties in Europe, however, they were ultimately destroyed by world historic forces far beyond their control. The Yiddish-speaking Jewish working class, which had been the core constituency of these parties, was virtually extirpated in Eastern Europe by the Nazis and by those who worked on behalf of the Nazis. Communist victories, first in Russia and much later in Poland and elsewhere, eliminated the political space within which the Bund had earlier operated. In the wake of the Second World War, the East European Jewish left per se could not and did not survive. The arc of Jewish socialist movements in the United States was ultimately parallel to that of its cousins in Europe, though the reasons for the eventual decline of these movements were rather different. In the USA, economic and social mobility over the course of the 20th century diminished the proportional size of the Jewish working class. The relative openness of American society, which made assimilation possible, diminished the size of the Yiddish-speaking core population. The American Jewish left, created in the 19th century, peaked in the 20th and has dwindled in strength in the last few decades. Arthur Liebman wrote in a work published in 1979 that the income, occupational, and geographical mobilities that Jews experienced in America in one or two generations were body blows to the maintenance of a sizable, concentrated, and economically homogeneous Jewish working class. Although limitations on where Jews might work or live continued and continue, the opportunities were such that Jews as a people rather quickly moved from the working class to the middle class in America. This socioeconomic metamorphosis could not but be damaging to the Jews' commitment to socialism. Well, the trends described by my friend Arthur Liebman in 1979 have continued in the years since the publication of his book and do help to explain the continuing decline in ties between American Jews and the left. In the 21st century, leftist anti-Zionism and other factors have also contributed to reductions of support for leftist causes within American Jewry. The numbers of contemporary American Jews who support explicitly socialist or communist or anarchist movements is now rather small. American Jewry is more liberal than many other American ethnic groups on a broad range of issues. American Jewry is, however, not identified with the American political left at this point in its history, but rather with powerful mainstream American political institutions. Last year, as everybody sitting here doubtless knows, Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish and an avowed democratic socialist, and Hillary Clinton, who is neither Jewish nor a leftist, both ran presidential campaigns. My own political inclinations to the contrary notwithstanding, most American Jews, I strongly suspect, supported Hillary. Jews in other countries have likewise edged away from earlier sympathies for leftist ideas. The State of Israel had a string of labor-dominated governments in its founding decades. It has, however, elected right-wing governments with nationalistic platforms in more recent elections. The decline of leftist ideas in Israel seems to be related, and I list these in no particular order and very rapidly, to three different phenomena: immigration patterns, 2, matters related to the conflict with the Palestinians and other portions of the Arab world, and 3, changes in the class composition of Israeli society. Early waves of Jewish immigrants to Palestine and later to the State of Israel were made up, at least in part, of East European Jews who had themselves been influenced strongly by leftist ideas. However, neither the large wave of Jews from North Africa, the Mizrahim, which arrived in Israel beginning with the 1950s, nor the large wave of Jews from the USSR and from the successor states of the USSR, who began to arrive in Israel roughly a generation later, have expressed sympathy for socialism or leftist proposals. Moreover, the descendants of East European Jews who have immigrated to Israel in recent years from English-speaking lands have often come from religiously orthodox backgrounds and have regularly advocated both conservative social values and conservative political views. Certain other segments of the Jewish population of Israel, including Israeli-born descendants of the East European Jewish immigrants who had arrived in Palestine as idealistic leftists in earlier eras, these descendants became less sympathetic to leftist ideas than their ancestors had been as their class positions altered. The descendants of secularized East European Jewish immigrants to Palestine currently living in Israel are very regularly in the highest socioeconomic status groups and often sympathetic to business interests and concerns rather than to the interests of the Israeli working class. More generally, if you tie all that together, the Jewish population of Israel as presently constituted does not evince particular sympathy for the left. We're coming in for a landing. Bear with me. Jews in France, home to the world's third largest Jewish community, were even in the relatively recent past sympathetic to Socialist Party candidates. François Mitterrand, the first socialist ever elected to serve as president of the French Fifth Republic, received a plurality of the votes of French Jewry in 81 and 88, but the Jewish population of France does not seem to have given comparable support to the socialist candidates in France's election in 2007. Fears within the French Jewish population of rising anti-Semitism seem to have increased support for the law and order policies advocated by Sarkozy. Sarkozy also received a plurality of Jewish votes in the presidential election held in France in 2012, and there is more or less no evidence of substantial Jewish support for socialist candidates in the election which took place in France a couple of weeks ago. So, I didn't mean to wake anybody, but current Jewish political opinion in the three largest Jewish communities, the US, Israel, and France, which collectively constitute the overwhelming bulk of world Jewry, corroborates the idea that the one-time ties between Jews and the left can best be explained by political, economic, and sociological conditions which came into existence in the 19th century and which went out of existence in the 20th, rather than by reference to Jewish religious ideas or Jewish characteristics or other such factors. Now, this analysis, to be sure, leaves open the possibility that the relationship of Jews to the left might shift in the future, as it has in the past. A disastrous decline in the political and economic positions of American Jewry, for example, a re-marginalization might lead American Jewry to a reappraisal of its political stance. But surely there are few, if any, among us who desire a political realignment resulting from such phenomena. I'm a man of the left. I'm not, however, an adherent of what we used to call, tongue-in-cheek, the don't tip the waiter school of leftists. That is, those socialists who argued, and there were such people, that if conditions became much worse, they would spark a socialist victory, and therefore we ought, so to speak, not tip the waiter. Nah. The marginality of Jews in Central and Eastern Europe, the lack of opportunity for Jews in major institutions in Tsarist Russia, poor living and working conditions not only in Europe but also in the USA, explicit anti-Semitism, and the relative openness of left-wing movements all led some Jews in areas like the Russian Empire or the United States to affiliate with the political left at a particular juncture in history. However, the dramatically altered conditions in which most Jews live in the 21st century have resulted in a very different Jewish political profile at the present moment in time. The relationship of Jews to the left was a historically important phenomenon. I've spent much of my career attempting to understand it, but the relationship was one which was of limited duration. A final note. There are countercurrents. Nothing is set in stone. There was once a leftist of Jewish origin who noted that humans make their own history, though not under conditions of their own choosing. That sounds right to me. The project of the left, including, among other matters, the pursuit of an emancipated society, of egalitarian ideals, and the expansion of democracy from political to economic institutions, that project will continue. And there will be Jews who will endorse and participate in these endeavors. May they benefit from study of those who have preceded them. Thank you so much.
So we're giving you a chance to think about your questions. And if I saw a hand already, so if you want to start. Yeah, please use the mics.
I think you wisely began part of your presentation talking about the French Revolution, and also, you did not mention it, but the Napoleonic era, which led to a large liberalization of Europe, and amongst Jews participated in. Using that as an example, currently there are situations happening in Europe and America dealing with Muslims, and I might argue that too might be an impetus towards Jews and how they might partake in either left or, for that fact, even right.
Is that a question?
What's a question is commentary.
It's worthy of a comment.
Yes.
I'd respond by saying that Islamophobia is an important and dangerous phenomenon, and I do see parallels between the anti-Semitism that existed in Europe and elsewhere in an earlier era and Islamophobia today. However, I don't think, if I understood your comment correctly, that that's leading or might lead to some alliance between Jews and Muslims. In fact, what I'm seeing at the moment is that Jews in places like France, but also in Scandinavia and also in the Netherlands and also in Germany and elsewhere, are actually generally more likely to associate themselves with the opponents of the Islamic community than with the Islamic community itself, for a variety of different reasons.
In the back, a woman with blue, yeah. Yeah, you pointed to yourself, yeah.
Yes, I'm wearing red.
Oh, I can't see, it looked like blue. Okay, stand up, stand up. Doesn't it look like blue?
I deliberately wore red
Oh,
because
it's
of
red underneath, I see.
the topic. I don't think that you will buy what I'm going to put forward, but please comment on it. Your thesis rejects this, but I wonder if there's any, and it holds water at all, that perhaps there was this great interest in leftism coming out of the Jewish community because the Jewish religion, of all the Abrahamic religions, places the least emphasis on the afterlife. So in the Jewish religion, you're stuck with what you got here on earth. And also, it's very slight on metaphysics as compared to Christianity. So again, there's this emphasis on regulation, rationality, and then also not much in the way of afterlife. No, I don't think the leftists you talked about were thinking that through, but maybe there's something in the groundwater there, and I'd like your opinion on that.
So you're right, my thesis rejects that. And let me try to say a word or two about why that's the case. But it's time, I think, for a plug for the book. Because the first chapter of the book is written by Michael Walzer, who I think is one of the 3 or 4 most important political philosophers alive today. and I'm happy to report that Michael rejects it. So the first thing that I would ask is that you consider, if you have the time and energy, to read Michael's piece. Don't bother with my piece, but read Michael's. Read the pieces by the other people in the book. I'm not going to rehearse here what Michael Walzer says, but what I would say is I have a lot of trouble cherry-picking in Judaism to find those elements that support a progressive agenda, or that might support a progressive agenda, because one could also cherry-pick in Judaism and find lots of elements that support, and indeed supported over many centuries, reactionary agendas. One can read into Judaism whatever one sees fit, and I'm not going to argue with your understanding of the religion. I would just say that it doesn't make sense to me to attribute to Judaism the ties between Jews and the left that arose at a particular historic juncture. And one of the reasons it doesn't, and this is not something that Walzer discusses, but it's what's important for me, is look, those religious beliefs existed for many, many centuries before Jews became associated with the left. Many, many, many centuries. So why is it that those beliefs did not lead Jews to have progressive politics in the 1500s or 1600s or 1700s? And you know what? They didn't. They didn't lead Jews in those periods to have progressive politics. And my answer is that in the 19th century, economic and social and political conditions changed for the Jewish community, changed for the world in such a way as to create a catalyst for the formation of a left and for Jewish participation in the left.
Okay, Steve.
First,
Marion said you shouldn't pick on my friends, but I think we should. Thank you, Stephen.
First, congratulations on a superb and fascinating talk. It's really, really well done. Question about the United States. Jews were disproportionately involved in the civil rights movement. Now, you could say that, there was a Jewish self-interest in that, discrimination against blacks could hurt Jews, but how would you, situate that in your larger framework?
I'm not pointing any fingers, but I would say, let's take a look at the numbers and proportion of red diaper babies amongst those Jews who are active in the civil rights movement or in the anti-war movement or in the women's movement or. There were particular family backgrounds that, in which kids were being raised with leftist ideas, even in quotation marks, in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And a significant number of these Jewish kids raised in families that retained associations with leftist institutions became involved in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, etc. Many of my best friends are included in that group.
Please.
Thank you for saying everything you did. I have a few comments and questions. Isn't it true that the incidence of the example of the absolute commitment to their principles were what separated different political action groups, both in Europe and in the United States? And going beyond that, if you take the position that compassion is what carries the Jewish people, that compassion is what brought all these groups together as individuals, members of these groups, then wouldn't you come up with the proposal that what we need to do in this country is to make sure that we all feel secure in our political orientation, but beyond political orientation, in our commitment to
basic Judaism, because all these groups, to me, stem from the Bible and from Hillel, and they reflect the importance of Judaism to American life. They also reflect the importance of Judaism to the individual who seeks the ineffable.
I do understand the point. I guess that my answer, and I'm not being flippant, is that, you know, Marx's preface to the critique of political economy doesn't stem from the Bible. It ain't so. Marxism doesn't stem from the Bible. I don't agree with the notion that leftism or Jewish participation in leftism can be traced back to Jewish motifs. That doesn't mean that there were no Jews influenced by such motifs. There surely were. There surely were Jews who were on the left who came from religious backgrounds and who were influenced by their educations, were influenced by doctrines they had been taught. You know, I went to graduate school 40-odd years ago and told the admissions committee that I wanted to write a dissertation about tzedakah. And I wanted to try to explain the significance of the specifically Jewish understanding of justice to contemporary political movements. And the more I studied the history of political thought, the more I actually examined the texts, the more I saw that my initial idea was actually not a tenable idea. And so I'm afraid I respectfully disagree, but thank you for the question.
How about over here, the yellow shirt? I'm trying to get, trying to get my colors right.
I was wondering if you could compare and contrast, you should forgive this academic kind of thing, Christian socialism and Jewish socialism. I mean, there was this Dorothy Day Catholic worker stuff going on too. Could you say something about that? Was there any differences, similarities, whatever?
Esther, I'm not sure that I know enough about Christian socialism or about the Catholic Workers' Party to make that comparison. I would say that very few people point out that in the German Social Democratic Party, at a point when there was a significant number of Jews, the bulk of the members were either of Protestant origin or of Catholic origin. And in the same ways that we could say that there were Jews who were influenced to some degree by their backgrounds in their choice of parties, so too were there Catholics or Protestants. I think that the Catholic Workers Group, Day's group that you're mentioning here in passing, was a fantastically interesting group, and she was a wonderful and powerful woman. But let me remind you that in the days when she was alive, it may actually be a little bit different now. That was a very, very minor tendency in the Catholic world. She had a tiny number of adherents who were fighting the good fight, which is to say, I suspect, that Catholicism is not intrinsically progressive. Protestantism is not intrinsically progressive any more than Judaism is.
Since we mentioned Day, I'm going to take the position of the chair to ask another question, which had to do with gender. It's in the title. And I'm curious what Jewish socialist parties did to attract women and whether they were attracted to those parties.
You got an hour or two? I would like nothing better than to talk above all about what the Bund's position on this was. B'kitzur. What I would say is that the position of women in the Bund and the degree to which the Bund attracted women or were attractive to women differed quite dramatically in Tsarist Russia and in interwar Poland, which is going to corroborate my thesis. In Tsarist Russia, where the Bund was an underground party, an illegal party, women played exceptionally important leadership positions. When the first Central Committee of the Bund was arrested, 2 of the 3 people who stepped forward to take their positions were women. And women played very important roles in Tsarist Russia, in the Bund, in smuggling weapons, in smuggling literature, in speaking at demonstrations. They were going to prison in significant numbers. And we can point to lots and lots of prominent women in interwar Poland, where the Bund became a legal political party. The participation of women in leadership positions decreased very markedly, very significantly. And indeed, there was actually no more than a tiny handful of women in the most prominent leadership positions of the Bund by the end of that interwar period. Now, we could have a discussion about why that was the case, but just to underscore what I'm attempting to say, in a very different political environment and under different conditions, the constituency of the party changed.
Thank you. And that's also the case for Spanish anarchism. When it's dangerous, women take more of a role. When it becomes institutionalized, they get pushed out. But that's a different story. All right, I'd like to get some people from the back because I haven't given them a chance. The very, very, very back.
Wait till the mic is there.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. I learned a great deal, particularly from the first part. My problem with the second part is as follows. Number one, when you say that Jews have ceased to participate in the left, well, what left? I mean, if you look at France, if you look at Israel, if you look at the United States, there is no left to speak of. Except for, in the case of Bernie Sanders, well, it's true. I mean, I imagine it's true. Neither of us really know to what degree Jews voted for Hillary versus Bernie. But I'm just as certain as you are, if more Jews voted for Hillary than for Bernie, that there was enormously overrepresentation of Jews in the Bernie Sanders movement. So if you're looking for a symbol that there is still a connection between Jews and the left, you'd see it in that. In addition to which, Jews actually were surprisingly supportive of Labour in the last election in England, given the problems that Corbyn had with Jews. So I think that, I guess the problem I have with your causality is that it ignores the history of the left, in the decline of the left in these cases, as opposed to the decline of Jews in the left.
Well, thank you for that. I guess the first answer would be, I'm not sure I'm talking about causality here. What I am trying to describe is a larger trajectory that I see over time. What do we know about American Jewish voters? What we know is that something like 80% of American Jewish voters in this last election, more or less, voted for Hillary. Maybe a few percentages less, depending on whose polls you look at, and the rest voted for Trump. Do we know what the proportion of Jews who supported Bernie were? No, we don't. But I'll stand by the contention I made during the talk that to me it's all but self-evident that there were many more Jews who were supporting Hillary than there were supporting Bernie. I didn't say that Jewish support for the left had disappeared. I didn't say that at all. Sure, there are Jews who support the left. I'm one of them. Are they a major proportion of the Jewish community in the United States or in Israel or in France or in the UK today? And the answer is no, they're not. So yeah, look, as it happens, I was following that election in the UK very, very closely. I gather you were too. The Jewish community in the UK today is not supportive of labor. There are individual Jews who are. I know many of them. But it's a very small proportion of British Jewry, and that proportion has decreased over time, which is to say that events in the UK, so far as I'm concerned, tend to support the analysis I gave of what's going on in the three largest Jewish communities around the world.
Okay, the woman who just had her hand up next to the woman with green. Yeah, you. Yeah, I can't see the color. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not following a lot of what you're saying, but I think a lot of the reason that Jews in England or Jews in America are not voting for the left is because the left has become anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. Jeremy Corbyn is about the most anti-Semitic leader one could imagine. And I think going back to France, you left out the chapter of the Dreyfus affair. And I think most Jews were going to support any pro-Dreyfus elements, which had a lot to do with where Jewish sympathies ended up. Maybe you could comment on all of that.
I'm not sure I can comment on all of it. I can't comment right now on the Dreyfus affair, about which there is a library of books. And I'm not so sure that I can even comment knowledgeably on the Labour Party of the UK. But what I would say is, well, surely I don't think that Bernie Sanders is an anti-Semite. I mean, bear with me, please. Bear with me. I was happy to entertain your question, and please give me an opportunity to respond, to survive. No? Look, I'm going under. What I would argue is this. Look, you said, I think, Jews are not supporting the left because the left has so many anti-Semites. Look at Corbyn, right? And my response is, well, you know, as a scientific thesis, that doesn't work for me because Bernie Sanders, I don't see as someone who is anti-Semitic. One may, if one is so inclined, quibble with some of his statements about Israel. I actually don't, but I can understand how others might. But to think of Bernie Sanders as perhaps the most prominent example of a Jewish leftist in America today as anti-Semitic, it's not fair or appropriate. It just ain't so. And so that doesn't explain the relationship of Jews to the left.
There's a hand also the very, very back. Yeah.
Dr. Jacobs, thank you so much for a very informative talk. You've covered a lot of mileage in a very short time. I salute you. My question is, you mentioned in your talk about the 20th century, the left wing in America. Can you comment on the effect of the McCarthy era on the left wing? Thank you.
A comment on the effect of the McCarthy era on the left wing, well, you know, that's easy. I think it is, you know, during the course of the McCarthy era, any number of explicitly left-wing organizations, including Jewish left-wing organizations in the United States, ceased to exist. There were organizations that had their charters revoked by the state government or by other entities. There were periodicals that lost lots of subscribers because people were afraid to have their names on lists, and there's also a flip side to that, so to speak. The McCarthy era was a terrible, terrible time in the United States. The McCarthy era is also in the Stalinist era broadly defined, though of course it went past Stalin's actual death. And there were crimes, terrible crimes committed by the Stalinist regime, committed against the peoples of the Soviet Union, including the Jewish people of the Soviet Union. And when those crimes became known in the United States and elsewhere, lots of Jews who had up until that moment been sympathetic to the Morgenfreiheit, for example, or Camp Kinderland, for example, or the International Workers' Order. Lots of people who had been sympathetic said, no more, genug. They couldn't tolerate that, and they broke first from the party, and in many instances later from the left. So there was two things going on at one and the same time. There was a severe repression by governmental institutions, by McCarthyism, and on the other hand, there were, so from my point of view, good reasons for Jews associated with certain components of the left to reconsider and back away from those earlier affiliations during that period of time. How about two more questions? How's that?
How about two more questions? Well, excuse me, first I'm pointing to Sam Norwich, and then I'll get the guest from South Africa. Sam. Okay.
Since when do you need a mic? No, wait. It's coming.
There's another mic over there.
He can do this, I guarantee you. Good. So the question, please allow me to repeat very briefly what I see as the essence of Sam's question and comment, which is that a very high proportion of American Jewry supports the Democratic Party despite changes in the class composition of American Jewry over time. I think that's the core of what Sam is interested in. And that, of course, is absolutely correct, but it has precious little to do with what I was talking about. In the following sense of the term, the Democratic Party is, at best, a liberal party, and often it's not at its best. It's not a socialist party, or a communist party, or an anarchist party, and what I was talking about were Jews who were socialists and communists and anarchists at the beginning of the 20th century, not Jews who were Democrats. So there's been a, one could say, very important shift in Jewish political affiliations in America from explicitly leftist positions to liberal positions over an extended period of time. And then the question becomes, so how do you explain that? And I think maybe I can. And my explanation would go something like this. I think that American Jewry today, Marion has heard this from me, that American Jewry today is actually more like German Jewry at the beginning of the 20th century than like Russian Jewry at the beginning of the 20th century. When German Jewry was made up of middle class and upper middle class and professional individuals, and that was true to a very great extent, even in the early Weimar period, let alone earlier, German Jews voted for liberal parties, explicitly liberal parties, in very, very large numbers and percentages. If you look at the proportion of Jews who voted for the Democratic Party of Germany, which was a progressive liberal party at the beginning of the Weimar era, well, a plurality of Jews were voting for that party. What happened in a place like Germany was that as the Democratic and liberal parties disintegrated, fell apart, or became more reactionary, and all of those patterns were evident, more and more Jews, for lack of viable alternatives, shifted left. The proportion of Jews voting for the Social Democratic Party increased as the existence of viable liberal parties decreased. Well, you know, many American Jews, I'm not sure that I could speak to the numbers, but I think a majority of American Jews are descended from East European Jews and not from Jews of German-speaking origin. Marion might know those numbers better than I, but I'm pretty sure that a majority are actually descended from Eastern Europe, which is to say one might think that their politics would be more like the politics of Russian Jewry than like the politics of German Jewry, but they're not, because the class composition of American Jews and their relations to the larger society are more like those of Jews in late imperial or early Weimar Germany than they are like those of Jews in Tsarist Russia.
Our last question is going to go to our guest from South Africa.
Why don't you stand up?
Okay.
Stand
Okay.
up and we'll repeat this.
I'd rather, no,
Stand
the
up.
mic's working. The mic's working. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Now, I just wanted to throw something else in the mix, and my comment is historical. And that's obviously the disproportionate representation of Jews on the left in South Africa. In fact, they basically were instrumental in creating the ideology of the left and the Communist Party in South Africa. And in the interviews, which have been published, collections of interviews, they almost all cite their Eastern, either they came directly from Eastern Europe themselves or their parents, and they were influenced by their parents. But when it comes to the German Jews who came to South Africa earlier, they all cite the rise of Hitler, pushing them onto the left. I think, if I understood correctly, that previous comment over there, that you had the same in South Africa. You had the so-called communists who had very prosperous businesses and, they were becoming rich capitalists. But because they were fighting for human rights and democracy for the blacks, they supported the left.
Or the liberals.
Or the liberals. But a lot of them still had a lot of sympathy for the Communist Party.
I'm by no means an expert on South African Jewry. I think that at best I can say a line or two, and I would be interested in hearing more from you. But what I would say is, I think that Jews were indeed marginal in South Africa for much of their history, and that my thesis is that marginality helped to explain associations with the left. It's surely true that there were lots of Jews active in the South African Communist Party and in other liberation movements it has a great deal to do, so far as I'm concerned, with their positions in and relationship with the larger society. Thank you so much.
There is a reception outside for those of you who want to stay and talk and discuss.